It's Saturday, and welcome to another episode of PO Cubed, your chronological guide to Nintendo's handheld consoles. My name's DD Ash, and this week we're playing Nail and Scale, Final Fantasy Legend 2, Card and Puzzle Collection Ginga, Klax, and Nekojara Monogatari. Let's start the show. Nail and Scale DMG-DR, developed by IMAX and published by IMAX in Japan and Data East in North America and Europe. So, there was once this dragon. Dragons being what they are, they need to be vanquished. Thankfully, Dirk the Daring didn't answer his phone. We can only assume he killed himself somehow on the way to pick it up. So instead we settled on a frankly more competent hero, in a small boy with a woolly hat and pockets full of nails. He doesn't crumble into a skeleton as soon as being touched, but even so, the poor mite's been trapped in the dragon's heinous labyrinths. 50 of them, to be precise. Well, we're here anyway, so let's escape the dragon's lair and see if we can't nail the worm along the way. Your aim on each stage is to navigate your way through the maze to an exit door, avoiding or killing enemies. Nail in and scale in walls by firing an inexhaustible supply of these javelin-like bolts into them, then jumping on them in various ways to climb upwards or over gaps. There are various types of blocks on the maps. There are those that are not destroyable. Some of these can be climbed, others cannot. Many solutions require you to smash through certain blocks by firing a nail into it, then jumping on that nail twice. To do this, there usually needs to be at least 2 whole tile spaces above the nail to give you jumping room, but you are able to break blocks from above or from the side. I say usually, it's entirely possible to make certain solutions easier by exploiting a corner break tactic. Whether this was a deliberate mechanic or not is unclear, but in some cases an otherwise arduous level can be reduced to a walk in the park by passing through a section that the level designers probably didn't intend. The nail's hitboxes seem to be slightly wider than the sprite, so by firing a nail right downwards into the corner of a block, it is possible to jump right on the edge of it from a block diagonally up and to the side, allowing you to break through without actually jumping on it. Firing a nail into the floor allows you to somehow stand on the end of it, giving about an extra tile's worth of height. There are 3 collectibles available to you: a white nail that will not damage blocks, useful for scaling walls that can only take 1 jump before they break; a bomb nail, which can create a pathway through an area you ordinarily couldn't break; and an escape door that will create a portal to the next stage right next to you. Playing on the harder difficulty adds a 3-minute time limit to each stage, which is really pressing later on. Also, it cuts your jump height by roughly a third, meaning routes that were accessible to you in easy mode are no longer an option. It's an interesting way of making the game tougher, rather than just adding more enemies or giving the bosses more hit points. There are little subtleties to your movement capabilities that give a glimmer of polish to the game, such as falling, rather than jumping off a platform, allows you to jump 1 more time in mid-air, allowing skillful players to navigate narrow corridors over fire pits and such. It's also possible to pull off things such as climbing overhanging blocks with deft jump and fire motions that I see people manage on YouTube, but I'm damned if I can ever do. The music's not bad, if a little unvaried, and the graphics not quite as polished as something like Catrap, but I must give credit for an excellent ending sequence that looks incredibly cool, and cutscenes of any kind are something we didn't see a whole lot of early on. There's a real accessibility when you first pick up the game that I really appreciate, but a great level of mastery to acquire through constant practice that would make Nail and Scale a brilliant speedrun for someone with the talent. Get on it, people.
Okay, Dad, I just want to finish this game. Okay, Dad, I'm coming. Yeah, I'm almost at the end. What happened to summer?
Final Fantasy.
Yeah, Game Boy.
It ain't over till it's over.
Chill out, Dad.
Final Fantasy Legend II DMG-S2, developed and published by Square. We venture back to the land of SaGa for another rebranded title. Similarly to the first one, this one isn't strictly Final Fantasy canon, but then what can be considered canon in a series that spans so many different areas and eras? In Final Fantasy Legend II, a lot of the great aspects that made the first one unique have been retained and polished, and some of the more annoying features taken out. Revisit the first review to remind yourself of what I mean. So, you create your team of 4 heroes like before, but now in addition to the humans and mutants, you can also choose dragons, slime, imps, and robots. The robots' selling point is that their weapons are replenished when you visit an inn, so there's no constant purchasing and swapping in and out of arms. It's almost as if the inclusion of this character was in a direct response to fan feedback about one of the more irritating things about the first game. Some of the older races have been tweaked a bit. Before, you had to buy XP for the humans, but now the randomness mechanic that mutants used applies to all characters. The leveling up system is still not, visibly at least, numerical. There's no way to find out how many experience points you need to reach the next level, but seriously, try not to think about that too much. Keep on fighting through those creatures, and eventually new attributes and skills will be attained. The game is somewhat easier, though. Final Fantasy Legend II is a generous game in that, should a character fall in battle, they don't need to be revived at a church or anything like that. They are rejuvenated after the fight with 1 HP, and you can give them cures and so on to replenish their health. A real noticeable improvement, which I suppose could be put down to developer experience, is the overall imagery of the game. Where the first one suffered a tad from blocky and bland backgrounds, the sequel looks much better. The screen wipe transitions between scenes are delightful, and the attention to detail in the settings and characters is certainly an improvement. Musically, the game is still top-notch, with some familiar motifs from the first game coming through. Nobuo Uematsu is possibly the most renowned composer working around this time and through the 90s. Whereas a lot of composers were essentially jobbers who didn't get nearly the level of recognition they deserved, Uematsu certainly did, and does. A compelling and truly involving storyline, coupled with the replayability factor of choosing a different squad of heroes each time, makes for a truly brilliant RPG. Sure, it's not strictly a Final Fantasy title, but it's similar enough to pass off without too much of a stretch. I like to interpret these Legend games, or SaGa, whatever you prefer, as stories that could have been regaled to rapt audiences by a glee man in a tavern somewhere in the Final Fantasy universe. Not exactly canon, but sharing lore and atmosphere, and a legitimate cousin to the main series. If you play only one out of this trilogy, make it this one. It's a polished and honed, sharp as a sword version of the first game, improving virtually every aspect of what was already very good. You absolutely need Final Fantasy Legend II. Card and Puzzle Collection Ginga DMG-GGA, developed by System Soft and Tinyan and published by Hot B. Before the intro screen even pops up, you get given the choice between Japanese or English. Choosing the English shows us an alternate name for the game, Tornado Appetizer. What looks like 2 random words glued together is probably just that, a strange mistranslation. Ginga actually roughly means galaxy, meant, I guess, to represent the whole galaxy of different games on offer here. There are a massive 12 different games you can play. Suck on that, Trump boy. 4 of which use mahjong tiles, 4 use playing cards, and 4 are board games. The 4 mahjong games are pretty terrible. None of them are actual mahjong solitaire. Ghost seems to have completely arbitrary rules that involve turning over tiles, trying to get them all flipped over. However, depending on the number on the tile, the pattern of the ones that get flipped is different. You just go round in circles clicking on tiles until you get bored and change game. pressure is just as strange. You have to match tiles that are removed and replaced by other ones in a way I can't figure out. They can only be removed if they're on the edge, leaving a bunch of tiles stranded in the middle with no way to get to them. I have no clue what's going on with race. Allegedly the point is to match 2 stones, but clicking on pairs doesn't work. Clicking on the same number but different suit doesn't work. Combinations that do work don't seem to have any correlation with each other, and eventually I got so sick of the illegal move sound effect that I moved on. Array makes sense at least, but it's not interesting. You need to place stones on a board in such a way that they are removed. You have to remove 500 in total before the board gets too full. I can't imagine playing this for long enough to reach 500. All the card games are variants of Patience. Golf is the first one. This is a simple solitaire game where you have to remove cards that are one above or below the one in your hand. You have a limited amount of draws to use and you need to clear the whole board. Nestor has 49 cards laid out in rows of 7. You have to match pairs from the visible ones, including the 5 in your hand. The 2 jokers are also in play and can represent any card, clearing the whole deck. In Pyramid, the rule set is incomprehensible. I have no idea what the aim is. Based on the other games, you'd imagine it was to match suits, numbers, or have ascending-descending series. None of that is the case here. Who knows? Double has a 6x4 grid of cards. You have to match adjacent pairs. If you run out of pairs, you can move everything along and refill the grid with cards from the deck. Proceed until there are no more moves left. There's literally no skill involved in this one, it's pure chance. 15 Puzzle is one of those 4x4 sliding tile games that used to infuriate you as a child. You need to rearrange the pieces to make the original design, with only 1 free slot available. I hate it, but it does what it means to. Change is basically the same. I hate it too. Solitaire is not the card game or the mahjong game of the same name, unfortunately. Those would be good. This is Peg Solitaire, but without the entertaining puzzle spin that Laszlo's Leap gives you. Knight is a game you can play on a chessboard called Knight's Tour, whereby using the standard Knight's chess movement, you need to touch every square once, and only once. Riveting stuff. If you win, you get an animation of a bunch of dragons in a square. They all light each other's heads on fire with their flame breath. During any game, press Start to choose to retry the level, generate a new game, or change your cursor speed. Press Select to go back to the main menu. A really simple concept, but not having to reset your game every time you want to change is very considerate. Presentation-wise, I don't enjoy the music at all, but you don't need it. The graphics do what they should, not hampering your play and being clear enough to see everything. I'd say about 50% of the games are playable, and of those, 50% are actually reasonably fun. That's your lot though. With 12 games on one cartridge, they're not all going to be hits, but there might be enough in Ginga to keep you entertained for 10 minutes at least. With these multi-game carts, it seems the balance between quantity and quality is proving a difficult line to tread. Klax, DMG-KLA for the Hudson Soft version, and DMG-KX for the Mindscape version. Developed by Tengen and published by Hudson Soft in Japan and Mindscape in North America and Europe. I was somewhat torn when reviewing Klax whether to actually do 2 reviews. This is something of an oddity whereby the Japanese and Western releases are totally different games. Well, they're both versions of Klax, the falling block game released on literally everything, where different colours or shades of brick tumble down a conveyor belt, and you have to match them in their triplets by sorting them into one of 5 piles. If you manage to miss catching a couple, then it's game over. When I say they're different games, I mean that whereas the 1990 version released by Hudson Soft in Japan has a top-down, almost two-dimensional look to it, The 1991 Mindscape version that we got over here looks more akin to the three-dimensional style popularized by every other rendition of Klax. Of course, there's little variation on the theme when it comes to gameplay. In fact, they're almost identical. The difficulty builds up in much the same way, and you'll quickly become overloaded with blocks coming down all 5 lanes. Bear in mind you actually have to catch the blocks and drop them onto a pile. Miss one and it disappears. You can only miss a small handful before it's game over. Your movable platform can stack up to 5 blocks, and you will drop them in the order from top to bottom. Obviously, there's a certain learning curve that you may or may not pick up. It's a great game that, as an answer to Tetris, has always proven popular. The real question is, with so many iterations of Klax out there, are either of the Game Boy versions worth playing? Well, in short, I don't think so. If you own a retro console, there's a version for basically no money that is in colour. Klax really isn't suited to a grayscale screen in my opinion. Quite often you're relying on your peripheral vision to drop blocks onto the right pile. Having to focus on a particular shading, especially on the earlier systems with poorer contrast, hampers your ability to process moves quickly. You need to utilize instinct a fair bit in Klax, so having to take a split second to focus makes a huge difference. Besides, it's not as if there aren't enough block puzzle games on the system that do work. Need I name names, really? Ultimately though, I decided to combine the 2 releases into one review because, although they're quite different aesthetically, the meat of the game is almost identical and suffers from much the same issues. The Hudson Soft release is easier to play, with more identifiable shading on the blocks. However, it's ugly to look at because of that top-down perspective. I can't think of another existence of the game that used this way of representation, and it's strange. I can see why Tengen were told by Mindscape to remodel the whole thing for a Western audience. They should have kept the shading from the first version though, because while the 3D looks a bit better, the blocks are really hard to distinguish from each other, rendering the game really too difficult. Sound-wise, both games suck, but at least the 1990 release has intro music. In-game, you get little clicks each time a block rolls over, and a short jingle when a triplet is made. Such little effort is inexcusable. Like I say, there are lots of good versions of Klax. If I had to choose, I'd get the NES release because you get the great gameplay and look that you want, plus a cracking soundtrack. Seriously, that thing is crazy good, with hilarious song names like Leadfoot and Giganticus Breathalyzer. They sound like GWAR members. This is another of those instances where the Game Gear version is miles more playable than the Game Boy ones. Nekojara Monogatari DMG-NJJ, developed and published by Kemco. Think Sword of Hope, then think cats. Nekojara Monogatari marks the first instance of a reused game engine on the Game Boy. For someone so familiar with Sword of Hope, lauding it as one of the best RPGs of the Game Boy's early life, this was absolutely bizarre to me. Not in a bad way, I'm all about an adventure where the protagonist woke up one morning as a cat. He has to go on a grand adventure to retrieve the royal heirloom of Catland that has been stolen, as it's the only way to change back to a human. I'm not going to say a great deal about this, as the game is almost identical to Sword of Hope. You can just listen to my earlier review of that game, because a lot of it still stands here. The map layouts are even very similar, if with a different motivation for your actions. I really think this was a massively underused RPG format on the Game Boy. It opened the doors to lots of different puzzle opportunities, like we saw with Shadowgate on the NES, and like we almost saw with Mysterium on the Game Boy. Restricting the view screen to a small box cuts down the amount of world building you have to do, and allows much more flexibility with using items or interacting with the surroundings. It makes the game feel more like an adventure too. I find this sort of thing much more immersive than your standard viewing the protagonist from afar kind of deal. Here, you're literally experiencing the adventure through the main character's eyes. So it may feel like a rip-off, but it's not really. Sure, a lot of the game may have been recycled, but there has still been more effort put into the story, characters, and sound quality than you got in a lot of games from the time. Plus, having a cutesy visage would have opened up this genre to a different audience. Thanks for listening to the Portable Power Podcast. If you want to support the show, the best way to do so is on Patreon at patreon.com/portablepowerpodcast. Or subscribe on the YouTube. We have daily uploads Monday to Friday, where you can watch me suck at the games as I talk about them. You can tweet me at POCubed or on any of the other socials you might expect. Thanks again and have a great weekend.